In Europe, 1848 was a year to remember, a year of dramatic, violent events, of hope and of failure. It was the year of death as a cholera epidemic swept across Europe, causing such loss of life that for a while society in many areas was totally disorganized. It was the year that Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto was published. This did not have the drama of the cholera epidemic and attracted little attention at the time, but in 20 years its message had spread across Europe and beyond to become, a century later, the basis of the political system of half the world. In the spring of 1848, revolutionaries, to the delight of Marx, seemed to carry all before them across Europe. The key question is, to what extent was there a general European revolutionary movement in 1848? Why did revolutions in France, Germany, Prussia, Austria, Hungary, and Italy all happen in the same year? Historians used to think that the French troubles, beginning in Paris in February 1848, triggered off copycat revolutions in other countries. Now, generally accepted view is that the revolutions took place at the same time because conditions across Europe were very similar. These conditions, economic, social, and political, are seen as giving rise to the revolutions. Most historians agree that the German revolutions resulted, at least in part, from a social and economic crisis. However, the precise nature of this crisis and its effects on different classes have generated much debate. Since the middle of the 18th century, Germany's population had grown dramatically, doubling in the century up to 1848. The rise was probably due to more declining death rate than to an increasing birth rate. The result was that some areas found it difficult to sustain their populations. Thus, people left the land and drifted to the towns in search of work or went to other parts of the world, hoping to better themselves. Of the 250,000 who left Germany in the 1840s, most went to the USA. Those people who remained in the countryside found life hard. In eastern Prussia, much of the land belonged to the Junkers and was worked by landless peasants. Even in the parts of Germany where the peasants had become tenant farmers, rents were high and it was very difficult to make a living. In most towns, there was insufficient jobs and housing to cope with the influx of migrants from the countryside. Living and working conditions were often atrocious. Even in good times, workers were poorly clothed and fed. From the mid-1840s, there was unemployment in many industries. One observer reported that unemployed factory workers were living in dirty, damp, and overcrowded accommodations, often 20 people to a room, 6 or 7 to a bed. When work was available, working conditions were grim. The machines, especially in the textile factories, were not designed with the workers in mind. Men, women, and children worked for 13 or more hours a day, often in awkward positions crouched over the machines. Inadequate sanitation encouraged diseases like typhoid and cholera. Many newcomers, unable to find work, depended on charity or turned to crime. Strikes and riots among the urban working class multiplied in the 1830s and 1840s. Towns had concentrations of discontented people who were far more likely to act together than their rural counterparts. It is worth noting that the 1848 revolutions in Germany were overwhelmingly urban. Across Germany, industry was growing in the early 19th century. Skilled workers felt threatened by the advance of mechanization that forced down the cost of production and made hand-produced goods relatively expensive. In 1846 and 1847, the corn harvests were disastrous, and the situation was made worse by a serious outbreak of potato blight. Potatoes were the main item of diet for most German peasants, and the failure of the crop meant starvation. There was distress and unrest, and food riots broke out. There had been poor harvests before, but the increased population made the position worse. In industrial towns, there was a sharp rise in food prices. Cereal prices increased by nearly 50% in 1847. In Berlin, the Potato Revolution occurred. Barricades were erected, shops looted, and the Crown Prince's palace stormed before soldiers restored order. Across Germany, the rise in food prices led to a reduction in consumer spending on items other than foodstuffs. Consequently, craft and industrial production suffered a steep fall in demand, to which employers responded by laying off workers. There was thus a rapid increase in unemployment, particularly in the textile industry. Even those in work found their wages cut. The standard of living of most workers fell alarmingly as higher food prices coincided with lower wages. In both town and country there was growing unrest. Dissatisfied with the existing state of affairs, workers and peasants demanded a better life for themselves and their families. Most of the demands were concerned with practical matters: higher wages, better housing, a shorter working day, not politics and political theories. There were some exceptions. In some towns, skilled craftsmen had their own trade organizations and kept themselves apart from the unskilled factory workers whom they feared and despised. During the 1848 revolutions, the leaders of skilled workers staged riots and elected representative assemblies to discuss their grievances. Historians remain divided about whether class consciousness was developing among industrial workers. This was a key issue for Marxist historians who believed that historical change grew out of conflicts between classes. Karl Marx, a German revolutionary, argued that industrialization developed, each class evolved its own consciousness. He believed that the proletariat was inevitably opposed to the bourgeoisie. Marx and Marxist historians since argued that the 1848 revolutions were caused by the effect of industrialization on the working class. Certainly in Germany, it was often workers who fought and died in streets behind the barricades. However, it was not only the workers who made the German revolutions. Others played an important part, particularly the liberal middle classes. The economic crisis helped to shake the prestige and self-confidence of many existing regimes. Most lacked the financial and bureaucratic resources, and also possibly the will to intervene effectively to alleviate the social distress and reverse the economic collapse. The caliber of rulers was not high, and many monarchs and their ministers attracted a great deal of personal unpopularity, particularly from the growing number of educated middle class, lawyers, doctors, journalists, teachers, and civil servants. In 1848, power lay where it always had, with nobility who owned the land, filled senior government jobs, and officed the army. They guarded their privileges jealously against any infiltration by the middle classes. Middle-class Germans were critical of systems which largely excluded them from participation in the political process, and in which they were restrained from free expression of their grievances by the censor and the secret police. Many of the dissatisfied middle classes wanted the establishment of some form of parliamentary system and the guarantee of basic civil rights. Middle-class Germans also wanted to see the establishment of a united Germany, which they claimed would ensure national prosperity. The impetus for German national revolution came from the small state of Baden in southwest Germany. In 1846, the Grand Duke of Baden had been forced to accept a liberal constitution. In consequence, the Representative Assembly was elected on a wider franchise than in any other German state. Not surprisingly, the people of Baden were more politically conscious than most Germans. Throughout the 1840s, liberal politicians in Baden had supported a united Germany. Now they put their views forcefully to an assembly of liberals from all the southwest German states. This assembly, which met in October of 1847, agreed on the urgent need for a German People's Parliament. While this meeting was going on, radical politicians, mainly from Baden, were holding their own meetings in southwest Germany. The radicals wanted fairer taxation, education for all, a people's army, better relations between employees and workers, and most importantly, the establishment of a united German republic. In 1848, few Germans expected revolution. There was still widespread loyalty to the established dynasties. Moreover, the economic situation was beginning to improve slightly. Nevertheless, economic distress in the major cities, which continued over the winter of 1847 to 48, helped to spurn revolution. The urban and rural poor, however, did not have a clear set of aims and were often untouched by the radical, liberal, and nationalist ideologies of the middle classes. On the 24th of February 1848, King Louis Philippe was overthrown and a republic was established in France. French revolutionaries' proclamation of the idea of sovereignty of the people called into question all established authority. News of the events in France helped to spark revolution in Austria. On March 13th, there was mass demonstrations in Vienna. The situation quickly got out of hand, especially in working-class areas where there was widespread looting. Metternich fled, and the army, whose loyalty was suspect, was withdrawn from the capital. The city was left in control of radical students and their working-class supporters. Metternich's fall had a profound effect on most Germans and added fuel to the revolutionary feeling. In some places, peasants attacked their landlords, stormed castles, and destroyed feudal records. Elsewhere, artisans used the opportunity of breakdown of law and order to destroy new machines that they saw as a threat to their livelihood. In Baden, radical Republicans tried to lead a peasant and worker rising. This attracted little support and was quickly suppressed by the liberal government. Meetings, demonstrations, and petitions, not armed risings, were the chief weapons of the middle-class revolutionaries who hoped to work with and not destroy the princes. Most German rulers lost their nerve, giving in easily, if temporarily, to demands for more representative government. Almost everywhere elections were held, liberal ministers appointed, constitutional changes set in train, and the remnants of the old feudal order abolished. There was relatively little violence. Only in Austria and Prussia were there serious confrontations between the people and the military. For a time, the revolutionary fire seemed irresistible because no one was fighting it. Although the eccentric Bavarian King Ludwig I was forced to abdicate, in most states the old rulers survived and watched developments. Moreover, it was soon obvious that the urban liberals had little sympathy with the peasant revolts in the countryside. In some instances, new liberal governments, appalled by the destruction of private property, sent in troops to restrain the peasantry. In May 1848, Austrian Emperor Ferdinand I agreed to summon a constituent assembly elected by universal suffrage to draw up a new constitution. The government, which moved to Innsbruck, was reformed to include a few liberals. Faced with serious revolts in Italy, Hungary, and Bohemia, Austria was too engrossed in its own affairs in the spring and summer of 1848 to exert its customary influence on Germany. Events in Berlin in March 1848 prevented Prussian King Frederick Wilhelm from taking action against the revolutionaries. In March 1848, at a meeting in Heidelberg, 51 representatives from 6 states, Prussia, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, Nassau, and Frankfurt, discussed changes to Germany's political institutions. They did so before revolutions had made an impact on individual German states. On March 5th, their decisions were published in the Declaration of Heidelberg, where they called for a meeting of national representatives elected in all the German lands according to the number of people, both for the removal of imminent internal and external dangers and for the development of the strength of German national life. Here's your chart over the causes and the course of the German revolutions of 1848. There was a general European crisis which caused havoc with the political system. Developments in Baden helped spread liberalism and nationalism. On the other hand, perhaps there was class consciousness. Economic crisis led both workers and farmers from the countryside to protest during this time period. Food prices were way up while wages were way down. The course of the war was influenced certainly by the French Revolution of February 1848. Its spread and revolution was in many German states. Revolution also affected Austria and caused the fall of Metternich. Later, the Declaration of Heidelberg led to constitutional changes and liberal governments. In 1848, France, the German Confederation, Habsburg lands, including Austria, Hungary, and Italy, experienced revolution. One striking feature of the 1848 revolutions, both in Germany and elsewhere, was how quick they succeeded. Another was the fact that all equally rapidly failed. The revolutions are complex affairs. Some historians claim that general European-wide factors explain the cause, course, and failure of the revolutions. Others stress that revolutionaries in different areas had different grievances and demands. Even within specific countries, there was often little cohesion among the revolutionaries, and that is why they soon collapsed.